Hello, friends. Hello, everyone. Just want to um, check on audio, checking the audio level now, and making sure this still works with the OBS restream. So, give me a thumbs up if you hear me, and if you're on the YouTube side, let me know if there's some problems. Okay, let's just run with it. This is my first time doing a restreamed space, so I'm sure this will be fun. Um, yeah. Hopefully Manny will be able to make it. But Trace, how are you feeling today?
Feeling good, feeling good. Thanks for having me on.
Cool, cool. Do you prefer Trace? Do you prefer I don't know,
Let's
I
go
don't know,
with
are you
Trace.
doxxed?
Yeah.
Okay, let's
I
do
mean,
Trace.
I'm doxxed, but like on Twitter, whenever people use my real name, it feels weird. So let's stick with Trace.
Many such cases. Uh, what's the vibe? What's the deal with Ayn Rand?
What is the deal with Ayn Rand? I hadn't really touched her work until pretty recently, and the vibe that I got from it from a
Weird. So
distance was
let's
very
stick with
much the
Trace.
like uh,
Many
ultra
such cases.
libertarian,
So
like
let's stick with
crypto and
Trace.
fedoras type of vibe.
Many such.
Um, but I kept noticing that like uh anytime I met someone who actually self-identified as an objectivist or as something like an objectivist, they had a very different feel to that stereotype that I had, that image that I had. And I sort of like came at Rand through the back door of someone who I really appreciated their moral frame, their aesthetic frame, everything being like, well, no, I'm an objectivist, blah, 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 you should read Rand. And then finally getting around to actually reading her, reading Alice Shrugged, and thinking that the parts that weren't libertarian were a lot more resonant with me than I had been expecting, even as the parts that were libertarian were still as uninteresting to me as libertarianism has always sort of been.
What do you mean the parts that aren't libertarian?
Yeah, so uh, Ayn Rand hated the term libertarian. Like she was always fighting it, and she like rejected the Libertarian Party, rejected that whole frame. And what I would say differentiates her from this sort of like libertine libertarianism that I'd sort of had in mind is that in as much as she is focused on reducing government, is focused on this whole like aesthetic of freedom, whatever, it's much more Nietzschean, I would say, than standard libertarianism in the sense of she's a lot more interested in the question of who is accomplishing great things and why, and how can we encourage people to accomplish great things? How can we create a culture in which greatness is celebrated and in which remarkable accomplishments happen than she is in cultivating a culture of everyone do whatever they want all the time. And that's what uh, eluded me from a distance about her approach.
Yeah, yeah. I was listening to a podcast just this morning with Russ Roberts and Jennifer Burns. Jennifer Burns wrote a biography on Rand, and she was talking about how Rand was always getting into fights with Milton Friedman and like Hayek, and she hated this like utilitarian conception of libertarianism, right? for her, like libertarianism was like, or let's say like capitalism and markets. It was downstream of the morality. It was not this like, it was not this thing where like you wanted to be efficient for the service of others. I think Atlas Shrugged is actually the book where she gets the most into that. You have all of the Atlas Shrugged is the book with the biggest number of kind of like incomplete characters in her mind, right? Stadler, Hank is somewhat like this. Francisco d'Anconia is somewhat like this. They're like not quite John Galt, right? Like John Galt likes them, but they're not. But they need to be like taken in.
Yeah. Um, no, and one thing that so she gets a lot of flack for her novels being so didactic. Uh, I honestly really appreciated that in the end. I thought that the didactic approach of just like having these characters that were just here is this representation of an ideal that I have in mind is in some ways a lot more honest than a lot of other political fiction. Like she's not hiding the ball. She's not like trying to make people think there's anything other than precisely what's going on there. She just throws a bunch of characters out and tells everyone very directly, like, yeah, these people are all just stand-ins for what I think the optimal moral ordering of society is, what I think like the lessons I want people to learn. I'm going to hit you over the head again and again and again and make sure that you have no illusions about anything that I am doing with this.
Yeah, this is something. This is something that's just fascinating for me in the book is that um, there's something in philosophy books, especially like modern analytic philosophy books, where they're in some ways more deductive than Rand, right? Rand understands repetition. Rand understands, I think, the kind of romanticism and how people are kind of tempted by and then drawn to and then taken in and then like fully commit to an idea in the way that a lot of modern philosophers don't, right? Like people make fun of the John Galt speech, right? Which is a lot of just like, philosophy and is actually, has more of the problems that I just talked about with modern philosophers. But what happens before that is, it happens like what 1,400 pages into the book. It happens so like 7/8 of the book happen, and then you have like, and then like 1/16 of the book is this like enormous speech laying out like basically Ayn Rand's philosophy. But yeah, I think like all these themes are alluded to throughout the book. All this like this romantic nature takes place like with the characters themselves, right? You have this like kind of call to adventure, call to reject guilt with Hank Reardon and with Dagny Taggart and with Francisco d'Anconia, and this just happens like over and over again, right? It happens in like different ways to different people with like different objections, and there's a lot of repetition, but it's sort of like it's not just repetition. It's the it's really like literary in an important way.
Yeah, I do honestly think, and this might be too controversial an opinion. I think the book would be better without the like long, hefty John Galt speech. I don't think she actually needed that, and think that that uh, when people deride that speech, you know that they're right. The speech is pretty ridiculous, but the repetition throughout the rest of the book, I went in not sure at all like would I enjoy the book, would I enjoy all this repetition, what will I think of all of it, and I came away like. Uh, you know, it's always tempting to be hipster about these things and be like, oh yeah, everyone's totally right. But no, it's a fun book, and the repetition works. The like all the storytelling works. The characters work. It. I read it when I read it. I read it in like a span of 2 or 3 days. I was just. I just had a lot of fun with it the whole way through. I was astonished at how much I enjoyed it, really.
Oh, you read it within 3 days? Damn. Yeah, I've been doing my reread like across like 2 weeks.
Yeah, it was just like, look, when I find something, I just end up sinking my teeth in. And in this case, I was like, okay, I read it like 6 months ago at most for the first time, and so I'm like, here is this person who has influenced a pretty large subset of culture and thought that I've only been dimly aware of. So I should rectify that really quickly, and that's why I did a several day uh, just diving in.
Yeah. And you mentioned the influence of Nietzsche. I think that's absolutely right. I think that's really clear in the in Atlas Shrugged, and in her like she doesn't just write novels. She writes these like philosophical essays. She has a famous one called the Romantic Manifesto, which is kind of seen to be as like the philosophy equivalent of the Fountainhead. And yeah, the influence of Nietzsche. That's one thing that I definitely want to cover. I know Mandy knows a lot about this as well, but let's get started. Let's ask you the question first. Um, yeah, are you appealed? You said you found the non-libertarian arguments appealing. Do you find like the Nietzschean element appealing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that's the thing that, like I said, sort of caught me off guard about Rand, and the reason that I think I've been drawn to her via the back door is that I am really drawn to people who take this like unapologetically moralist approach to life, an unapologetically like virtue focused approach to life. People who are like essentially um, there is an ideal way to live. Here is what gets you closer to this. Here is what gets you further from it. And here is my unified moral and aesthetic vision for the world. And so even as I would like dispute parts of Rand's vision, parts of the like I'm not anywhere near as anti-government as she is, for example. This image of just um, drawing someone towards greatness, this image of like her idealized picture of a hero as just like absolutely committed to doing something right, to figuring out every step of the way, what does doing it right look like here? What does perfecting my craft look like here? What is the best way to do this, and how can I get past every obstacle in the way to make that happen? There's just this absolutely ruthlessly pragmatic, excellence focused angle under this undercurrent in all her characters or all her heroes of that I think that really speaks to me.
So this is something that's kind of like contentious between Rand and the libertarians. Is like this is kind of what the main plot point of Atlas Shrugged is about, is like basically no half measures, philosophical purity over and over and over again, right? The main like character tension in the book is like I guess I should just explain it to the viewers. It's kind of about like the rise and fall of America, the rise and fall and rise again of America, and the deal is like America's collapsing because it's like kind of taken over by communists. And the big tension in the book is whether the main character, Dagny Taggart, and another main character, Hank Reardon, whether they basically like go on cooperating with the system and producing things in whatever way that they still can, or whether they whether they abandon them and they all go out to this like secret. I'm like 100% literal here, by the way, where they all go out to this like secret libertarian compound where all of the or like secret objectivist compound where all of the like Randian objectivists are like hiding out. And the point of Rand's argument is basically like there are no half measures. That one of the characters, Francisco D'Anconia, says to Hank Reardon, another protagonist, like the guiltiest man in the room is you, right? The guiltiest man in the room is the capitalist who like cooperates with the communists and like keeps trying to make their life better, even as they try to make his life worse. And it's interesting because um, maybe I have the opposite take of you, of like the uncompromisingness is something that I dislike about Rand, whereas the kind of like vague, vibey direction is something that I approve of when it comes to Rand. But how are you thinking about that kind of like more moral absolutism and the kind of no half measures perspective?
Yeah, well, it's important to emphasize that I'm not an objectivist, and so if Rand met me, she would probably loathe like 90% of what I said. She'd be like, "This person is mixing some good bits with all sorts of bad bits. This person is, in as much as he's talking about me at all, he's misunderstanding me and warping my words and whatever." I don't think that she would exactly see a fellow traveler in me. Um, but so when I talk about like admiring this moral core and admiring this moral frame with it, I'm not. I think that the uncompromising, pure objectivist, so forth, is um, halfway between eccentric, naive, and clunky. It just like it makes it someone who takes that sort of thing really literally would become a really obnoxious person to work alongside and to work with, I think.
Hypothetically,
Um,
hypothetically.
yeah.
We can
Uh,
talk more about like the objectivists, the like weird objtivist cult later, but like yeah, go on.
yeah. But in terms of someone who uh, when you're taking it out of the realm of the political, and I think honestly, I'm a lot more interested in Rand out of the realm of the political than I am in Rand in the realm of the political. That is, if someone looks at Rand and says, "This is how politics and government should be organized," and I will brook no compromise on how government should be organized with this, I think that uh, I would often find that kind of insufferable. But if someone looks at it as a model for as an approach for their personal life, I find that sort of like uncompromising objectivist in a personal life extremely easy to deal with and extremely easy to work alongside, because if you have someone who's just saying, "Here are my interests, here is how I want to pursue them, and I will work with someone in as much as it advances my interests, and my focus is on being competent and being capable and being remarkable in my own domain," that is the sort of person who immediately, like, if you have any interest alignment at all, you can find mutually beneficial areas to work. You can find places where you align. You can look at them and say, "Here's what you want to accomplish. Here's what I want to accomplish." And suddenly, like, it makes personal interactions with a person like that, I think, flow extremely smoothly.
Yeah, there's this element where the characters the it's interesting because like in some ways the characters that are kind of portrayed as the most correct in Atlas Shrugged are the ones they're the ones that like kind of cooperate with the other capitalists and kind of like defect from the mainstream, right? But there's some way in which like yeah, she presents all of them, right? Maybe especially the ones that cooperate with like the government as like the as like basically tools, right? She explicitly talks about this how like Dagny and Hank are like you know the hosts of all of these parasites, right? Um, and so there's some way in which like you don't have to entirely be an objectivist to see that like actually we should just have more of that, right? We should have more production and we should have more people who are like just doing things. And she says that like basically if you accept that you want more people just doing things, if you think that it's a moral good to have people like that, then like when you accept the half measures, then you're creating a system that like takes advantage of these people and like basically makes it harder for them and like I don't think she would put it in these terms, but like basically like subsidizes their destruction, right? um but I assume you don't entirely agree with that, so how is that argument wrong?
Yeah, in terms of like people subsidizing their destruction, things like that. Look, I take a lot. I'm extremely pragmatic in my approach to the world, and I take a lot of influence from things that have actually worked in practice. So I compare, Rand's objectivist vision of this absolute purity in terms of like culture, capitalism, society, and I compare it to something like Lee Kuan Yew's approach. And Lee Kuan Yew in some ways was extremely, extremely deeply Randian. I would argue that he is one of the closest archetypes of a Randian hero through a certain lens. And in another sense, he was extremely statist, as it were. He was happy with redistribution, things like that. And specifically, what he wrestled with, he started out as a socialist, and he talked about believing in socialism and fair shares for all before realizing that, uh, market economy and a system of rewards would just ultimately led people to be a lot more effective and productive and happy to work in general. And so he shifted gradually while maintaining a virtue in uh, preserving a society's sense of fairness and preserving the sense because people are fundamentally unequal in ability and talent and position. If you have a situation where you say people will get exactly the fruits of their own labor, no more, no less, then you do wind up with a situation where a lot of people from the beginning are fated to be in much, much, much worse positions than everyone else. And I think that it is actually ultimately reasonable if you want to run a society, if you want to run a culture, to recognize that and to say, look, it is awesome that we have some incredibly productive and skilled people who are uh, more capable and more willing to be capable in some cases than other people. But um, it is, uh, I ultimately agree that it is both, it leads both to a less stable society and a society that uh, most people are not as happy with if there is no form of um, redistribution, if there is no way in which individual accomplishments benefit the collective beyond simple, uh, market dynamics.
Yeah, so I know I keep returning to this, but I just think it's so important. But like, I actually think like from the framework of Atlas Shrugged, right? Like even more than like Dagny Taggart, Lee Kuan Yew is the person, or like Deng Xiaoping would be like the person that Rand hates the most, right? The person who kind of makes the state system that makes the communist system keep functioning, right? Deng Xiaoping is kind of the ultimate Dagny Taggart, or you can say Lee Kuan Yew is, but yeah, she has this kind of like idealistic um, vision of human nature, where if you just let go of the morality, if you just let go of the kind of Christian proto communist moral code, then everything will be good and people will not want to harm each other, and so on, kind of Rousseauian almost. And this is the thing that he litigates over and over again, and this is actually the thing that I like most disagree with her on throughout Atlas Shrugged, I think, is that like she I think actually like the person she has the most contempt for in the entire book is like Dr. Sadler, right? Do you remember who Dr. Sadler is?
Yeah, yeah, he was the one who could have been more.
Yeah, kind of. So he's basically he's like one of the cooperators. He's one of the like geniuses who cooperates with the government, and he kind of like gets fucked over the most in her book. But he's basically like an academic who's a very talented physicist and is slowly kind of like forced to like reject and deny all of his values, all of the things that he cared about the most, because he chooses to cooperate with cooperate with the state basically. And
Right.
uh,
Well,
sorry, go on.
um, yeah, I mean, what I'd say with him is it's not just cooperating with the state. It's uh, essentially, and the reason I called him the one who could have been more is that, Rand, and I think this is one of Rand's truest insights, even though she identifies it as specifically like this network of objectivists, whatever, and I think it's more realistic to look at something like Salmon's Live Players and say, essentially, there are some people who understand the shape of the world more clearly than most other people and do more things within it than most other people and are more capable of doing meaningful things within it. Anyway, so Stadler is one of those people in her book. He is explicitly like the sort of person who, in her eyes, should have been an objectivist, and instead you see him making continual moral compromises where he chooses to lie, he chooses to obfuscate truths that he understands, he chooses to make moral compromises that he knows are moral compromises, and so yes, in practice, that comes down to just like collaborating with the state. But I think it's useful to emphasize and important to emphasize the moral nature of the compromises that he was making in terms of like consciously lying and consciously just like thinking of himself as I need to maintain this position. I need to play politics. I need to do these things. Therefore, it is justified for me to morally compromise myself in this way and this way. And ultimately, it will be better for everyone if I, instead of someone else, am in this position. And so these moral compromises are justified.
Yeah, yeah. It's like I kind of read him as the like Machiavelli character, right, or as the Leo Strauss character. Which is really interesting because he's not a he is like explicitly not a philosopher, and she kind of associates philosophy with overcoming this, right? She draws this contrast between like Hugh Axton, who ends up in Galt's Gulch, ends up in the like objectivist compound, and Sadler, who like compromises, like gets state funding for his like research institute. Um, and like dies in this horrible way. I'm not sure if we want to spoil the 50-year book, but I'll at least give a warning. We'll probably we spoiled some of it, but we spoiled the secret objectivist compound. But that's like kind of a meme. People know about that. So I guess spoiler warnings for Stadler. Um, but the moment like there's two climaxes, but like the one that stands out more to me is like they're like testing out this like state funded death ray. It's like literally a death ray. It kind of uses his research, and um and they like literally give him like a pre-printed speech, and he's like, and they're like, read this speech endorsing the state death ray. And then he does it, right, and it's this tool of like immense fear and repression and top-down control. And yeah, you're right in that it's like it draws this connection between um not just compromising from a utilitarian perspective, but from like an overtly it's a compromise of the mind, right? That's the thing that's most important to her. Although like
Yes.
what she ultimately argues, right? What she ultimately argues is that like they're kind of the same. That like inventing something for the state, or like kind of letting your inventions be used by the state, is like actually the same as lying for the state. um and like maybe you don't think that's true, but like yes, Stadler is just such an interesting character, because I had this tweet like a few days ago of like, I basically think Stadler in the real world, like Stadler is correct, right? There's no like Galt's Gulch. Maybe you shouldn't be like as kind of subservient as Stadler. Like there is a breaking point, but on the like marginal case, like Stadler wins, right?
Yeah. You know, I I always need to distinguish when I'm talking between like the uh version of pseudo Rand who's basically just like my self avatar speaking through vaguely her ideals and Rand's actual arguments.
I just
So
imagine like Rand as like a fox girl with ears. Sorry, continue.
oh dear. Anyway, but like in this like pseudo Randian lens, the sort of person who and the reason I would push back on this like Stadler is basically correct is the sort of person who I really identify with Stadler in my broader image of this is like so Razib and Nathan Kofnis had this exchange the other day where uh, they're talking about the story of this like 90-year-old professor who could barely walk, explaining how uh, when he's retired, or he might give up his emeritus status one day, and then he would tell people what he really thinks. Uh, and I think that's the sort of person who really exemplifies a Stadler in my mind. And I don't think that's the sort of person who wins ultimately. I think that that's the sort of person who finds himself caught up repeatedly in someone else's program and finds himself advancing someone else's program. And the whole way along, they're convinced that they have a better way, they have a better image, they have something that they would prefer, but they wind up molding themselves more and more and more into the shape of what the system they are in expects them to be. And I don't think those people win. I think they advance effectively within systems and then do very, very well to advance the ends of those systems while while completely failing to impart or protect or transmit their own ideals.
Hmm. Do you think Lee Kuan Yew is more of a Sadler or an Axton kind of guy?
Oh, I think Lee Kuan Yew is absolutely an Axton kind of guy. And this is where, again, I need to differentiate between Rand as Rand and Rand as my, like, these great men versus these, like, quote unquote great men parasites type dichotomy, if you're looking at it that way. In that, I think Lee Kuan Yew was extremely um, to his own detriment sometimes, extremely honest, extremely frank about how he saw the world and where he saw things. An example of a time it was to his detriment is when he tried to. He saw Singapore's population decline, and he tried to impress on people the importance of both natalism and the importance of, like, in particular, college educated women marrying college educated men, so forth, things like that. And he did it in a way that, he was very, very blunt about it, and ultimately it didn't work at all. Everyone was sort of repulsed by it. They were kind of disgusted by him with it. They're like, yeah, no, we're not doing that. It completely failed. But basically, my point there is he was honest to a fault. He was candid to a fault. He was blunt to a fault. He was extremely, extremely clear about what he wanted to accomplish, why he wanted to accomplish it, and even as he made, like, pragmatic, interest-oriented deals with people, uh, he maintained his own moral core very clearly. And I think that it's important to tease out that dichotomy between making pragmatic, interest-oriented deals with people versus compromising your own moral vision, because I really do think that it's core to at least, pseudo Rand approach is that if your approach is, look, it is in my self interest. It is in the interest of advancing my things that I will, despite being clear and pure and firm about my own convictions, I will find a way to work with this person who aligns with me in this narrow place and create mutually beneficial exchanges for us. That idea of mutually beneficial exchange is at the heart of our market approach. There's a distinction between that and then saying, I am going to compromise myself and compromise my own ideals, compromise my own vision, compromise my own sense of things, and subsume myself to this entity that is fundamentally against my own vision. And I would say Stadler is really representing that latter form, and Lee Kuan Yew is much more in that former vision.
Yeah, yeah, I think I agree that like the solution to this is basically that um you don't go along with her argument that like cooperating like basically like trading with people who you consider to be immoral or who got their wealth through like use of force or like the state whatever it's not entirely it's not exactly the same um as like lying, right? Or compromising your ideas, lying to yourself. That premise is just false, right? It's interesting because the scene that really asserts this, which is the scene that I talked about earlier with Stadler, like both kind of allowing his technology to be used by like the state death ray. I guess he didn't really have a choice, but like but like his technology gets used for the state death ray, and at the same time he's given this like pre-printed speech to read. Um, that like actually like those aren't the same thing, right? In real life, those aren't the same thing. And in real life, there's plenty of ways to kind of be a dissenter while still having like one foot in the system. And like you don't like purely want to be like the professor you talked about. You don't purely want to be like compromising every aspect of you up to and including your speech. But like for example, working at a university, there's like plenty of people who work at universities and do speak out and so on, who um, are are who are not traders who contribute a lot of good to the world.
Yeah, but you know, this is one thing where I think I have a different experience than a lot of people who are more right wing than I am, in the sense of I sort of absorbed this general memeplex of, oh, it's dangerous to speak your mind, you'll be punished, whatever. You'll face these career sanctions, you'll have this consequence, whatever. Um, and then I looked around and I was like, and I was outside of the system at the time I was looking around. I wasn't like, trying to go through the path of academia, but I looked around and was like, okay, well, what happens if I do just like uh, lay out how I really feel and lay out what I really think. And my experience coming at the system from the perspective of like an outsider who is like slowly uh, taking what opportunities the system presents to work within the system is that I haven't actually had to compromise any of my beliefs and any of my sentiments. I haven't had to like uh, tone down my approach. I haven't had to obscure what I really think to, get invitations to write for some of these like mainstream outlets or to advance within my law school or things like that. Um, it has been an asset to me to like it has been actively useful for me to be a little bit different and to be coming at a right angle to where everyone else is coming at. Um, and I think that well, I raise that because I think a lot of the people who are compromising themselves, saying like, I need to toe these lines so I can stay in a university. I need to like do this or do that. I think a lot of them are playing it much too safe. And both inside and outside of the system, a lot of people would benefit from playing it less safe and being, being earnest, not being like edgy, but just being frank about what they think and why. I think that the attitude of playing it safe has gotten people in a lot of trouble.
That's interesting.
Can I can I add a bit to that though? I mean, so
Yeah, yeah,
my
dive in. Go.
experience, yeah, sorry to hop in a little bit late. I'm still somewhat jet lagged. Um, I was going to say, I mean, I think that might be very well a function of the department or the university that you're in. Most recently, I was over at Stanford, and I've seen what the gating of these opportunities looks like. I mean, I think one of my favorite examples is one of my professors when I was doing my PhD. His specialty was industrialization, right? And so he's one of these rare figures that specialized first in Mexico and then Japan, and so could do the whole cross-country thing. And he had written two books, very good books, but he couldn't get tenure because he wasn't quite towing the ideological line. And so he then had to go write a book about how the word nature is gendered in Spanish and how this genderizing of nature affects kind of this whole like, interpretive scope of, how, Mexicans think about nature and, environmental rights and all this stuff. And that's the book that got him tenure. So I think sometimes I think the strength of the ideological test is somewhat proportional to the track that you're pursuing within the academy as well as kind of the ambitions that you have within the academy. So I would
Okay,
kind of caveat it with that.
that's fair, and I guess this is where my more pseudo-Randian side will come out, and that I'll say like that sort of tenure just isn't worth getting. Um, that in this day and age, I just frankly think that if someone is committing so much of their time and energy and effort to doing something like that instead of striking out on a more independent course and building something meaningful on the outside, well, if they can like maintain some position on the inside, fantastic. But like, I think
No,
that if they are,
I don't disagree with you. I mean, I that's why I'm not in academia.
yeah,
But I'm just telling you, I mean, I've seen this happen to some of my most brilliant friends. I mean, going through the PhD program convinces them that they have no other skill besides being a, historian or humanities professor. And, how could you possibly give up tenure at Stanford or Harvard or Yale? I mean, I did this a couple of years ago, and I did a report at Stanford where I had basically used this was chat GPT-3. I had analyzed every history dissertation ever published since 1870 and mapped out the intellectual lines of descent. But I mean, basically, a few things that I learned is like, like 60% of jobs went to graduates from like the top 10 universities or the top decile, something like this. So it's like the scarcity of the jobs, I think, makes this happen a lot. Reminds me of the Kissinger quote: "The stakes are so high because no, sorry, the fight is so fierce because the stakes are so low." It's like there's such a scarcity mindset that people do this, and I totally agree with you. If you look outside of academia, you're like, whoa, there's so much stuff I could do. Why am I sacrificing myself or betraying myself in this way? So I absolutely agree with you. I don't disagree. I'm just saying this is kind of how the system works and convinces people that it's worth sacrificing all of themselves for this.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, it's interesting because like despite having um or I guess I should frame it the other way. So I've been like personally screwed over by the kind of like Dr. Stadler character of like famous academic, like I'm kind of like very well known as a right winger, very well known as like someone who like does like government activism, whatever. um but I've been kind of screwed over by the Stadler types up to the point of like a fairly prominent academic in machine learning. I discussed some of the concepts that I'm going to use in my new startup, and he with him, and he basically said like, "Oh, I don't credit me with this at all," you know. And it's like kind of understandable, like right, like this is a guy who's kind of like apolitical, doesn't want to be really involved in politics, doesn't really want to be, especially involved with a right winger. Like, sure, right. Um, it's But on the other hand, like despite that, I kind of have a lot of respect for it. I have a lot of respect um, for this because like, and I think the reason why I have a lot of respect for it is that at the end of the day, I have a lot more sympathy for Sadler's idea of human nature than for Rand's idea of human nature. Right. One of the things that like she goes after him the most, and this is something I really like about Rand's literary style. She does all of these hints about how their religious beliefs and metaphysical beliefs and philosophical beliefs and scientific beliefs all tie together at the very end. Um, but one of the things she does is that like the earliest conflict that um, that Dagny has with Dr. Stadler is Dr. Stadler saying human stupidity is inescapable, right? I think that's almost a verbatim quote. And I basically think that's true. And now in the book, like this is ultimately what causes John Galt to kind of break with him, and for him to end up on the wrong side of his most important students, who end up founding Galt's Gulch. And it's like bad for him in the book, right? But I kind of think in reality that's true. That like human stupidity is inescapable. People are always going to be bound by passions. They're never going to be like fully logical, fully reasoning. And the only way that you can kind of make yourself, or there are certain roles in the world where the only thing you can do is to kind of like play by those passions, and to compromise, and to maybe not to like read the pre-printed speech, but to at least like yeah, not appear with right wingers on like right wing podcasts or on the boards of like startups associated with semi famous right wingers. I don't know.
So I don't really think those things are comparable. I don't think that if someone is focusing on technical things and wants to keep their head down and focus on technical things and do their technical work and then do other things behind the scenes, I think that's pretty different to
But that's
uh,
what Sadler does. Like that's Rand's argument, is that like that's the most evil thing, right?
Well, no. What Stadler does is grant legitimacy to and then put his sanction on as a trusted voice. You can trust these things because I am saying you can trust these things. And I think that's the sort of compromise that is really unacceptable. Is to put your sanction on something that doesn't deserve your sanction, to stamp your approval on something that doesn't deserve your approval, and grant it credibility that it doesn't deserve because you are giving it that. I think that you can work with things in more limited capacity, in a way that doesn't like do that granting stamp of approval. And I think like people who take this sort of human stupidity as inescapable approach often start treating people as like either rubes to be grifted, marks to be conned, or people to be used in cynical ways. I think that that is one way that someone can go through the world and achieve like a degree of at least material success with it. I think that ultimately it leads them into the environment that they invite from that, and sort of it degrades their own environment and it degrades the public environment. Whereas someone who approaches people generally more optimistically, they recognizes human fallibility, but approaches the world with a certain earnestness and a certain seriousness, allows the world to return that seriousness for seriousness. And I think that um, they wind up being a lot more useful in the world and getting a lot more meaningful benefits from the world as a result of that distinction and approach.
So this is really interesting. I just want to like clarify a little bit because I didn't understand the disagreement we were having fully. Um, I think like it's interesting because maybe like Ayn Rand and I agree about what happens in the book, but we both disagree with you, um, because I think what happens near the end is like there's this scene where like John Galt is telling Dagny about why he broke with Dr. Stadler, and he basically says like, oh, all of this was leading up to the moment where he like approves the death ray, right? All of this, like research, doing the State Science Institute, all like taking government funding, all of that was like all of that was kind of like almost like a devil's bargain that inevitably led to him like becoming a spokesperson for the state. That they're like actually the same thing, and I think you actually have like an interesting, maybe more correct reading of Stadler, where like the moment where he like yeah, this is actually like a very interesting open question of like whether Stadler has any agency left at the moment where he actually like gets on stage and reads the speech, right? Because it's kind of assumed um, that like he doesn't, right? That they're gonna that they're gonna kill him, that they're gonna like shoot him with the death ray if he doesn't read from the speech, and like all of the people in that room are like terrified. And maybe the solution is like, oh, he should like literally be willing to risk his life to tell the truth and to tell the truth to this like journalist who gets disappeared. Um, and that like everything up to that point that he still has agency at that point, right? Everything up to that point is like one thing, and then actually signing up to read the pre-printed speech is like another thing. And now that I think about it, like maybe that is a more realistic understanding of like how this works in the real world.
Yeah, so I think that uh, I would start a while before that speech, but the distinction I would draw, let's say, I would draw a distinction between, say, publishing in an outlet that you disagree with a lot of their publications, whatever, you disagree with their general line, but saying something that you earnestly believe in that outlet versus writing propaganda for an outlet, something that you are willing to pretend to believe to be advanced in that. And I would say that someone is not making, I think, a Stadler-like compromise to do something that they genuinely believe in under the purview of something that they don't. They make the Stadler-like compromise at the moment they stop doing something they genuinely believe in. At the moment they stop doing something they could earnestly defend on the merits and start making excuses to defend something on the merits or to defend something because it instrumentally gets them where they need to be in that. And I think that you can work with institutions in an honest way, in a principled way, recognizing that you have disagreements with the institutions, with the state, whatever, as long as there is that uh, core of purity of this is something that is earnestly mine, that happens they happen to be willing to provide a platform or whatever for.
Yeah, Manny, do you have a take on this? Do you have a take on the Stadler corruption arc?
I do. By the way, I wasn't sure if you guys had discussed this earlier in the time that I was not here about kind of there's something very unique about the Randian vision, and as I was looking for reviews of this, I noticed that none of these things mention this. But on your specific point, I think this is a theme that recurs throughout the book. Um, and so when I first read this book, I must have been 11 or 12 years old, and I didn't like it, and I didn't finish, and I threw it away. And now as an adult in his 30s, I picked it up again, and I think it's quite prophetic. I think one of the lessons that comes out is this notion of I don't know what to call it except something like courage. Like the the main idea is, or let me put it this way. I think the main conceit that people fall for is that they can make small compromises and that they can thread the needle um, on moral questions and that they're good at it and that they don't need to make small sacrifices and trade-offs. And so you could think of, an academic like Stadler, kind of accepting government funding, setting up the institute, saying the right talking points. These all seem like small trade-offs in exchange for something else. And I think the lesson of Rand is that one, you don't get to practice in actually moral discernment if you're constantly just caving in because the stakes seem so low. But two, you're reducing, in fact, the scope of freedom that you get all the way, and so by the end, you could say, well, at that point, it's a life or death question. It's an implied threat. Who knows? But this reminds me of kind of like whenever I watch a movie and it's like there's a hero and a villain, but they're both like cartel drug dealers. And at some point, you think to yourself, well, there was a long line of actions to get to the point of being a cartel, enforcer who's now in disagreement with the boss over, I don't know, killing a child. But it's like you must have done a lot of terrible things on the way there. And it somewhat feels like that's Rand's lesson. It's basically saying it might seem absurd or grotesque to be so like moralistic. But in some ways, you got to practice these small things. Otherwise, when you get to the big things, there won't be anything left. That's kind of how I always interpreted these sequences, and I think it happens to um, other players there. I mean, I think there's this question of like, when do you let employees go, right? If you think they're doing a good job or they're not doing a good job, it's this recurrence of like asserting your moral view in the small questions because it matters and builds up over time. I think that happens a lot throughout the book.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think Rand, um, you know, uh, Rand is almost like a Calvinist, like a secular Calvinist. She like there's a lot of things where if you understand Rand's philosophy, this is something that you really only get on a second read, or I don't know, maybe if you read like The Fountainhead, then you kind of expect it as well. Um, where she not only like foreshadows things, but she kind of inserts it into the logic of the universe. That this kind of there's these kind of like dominoes falling down. I think Sadler is actually one of the best examples. Sadler and then Dagny and those are kind of
Mm,
the best examples. And I was just looking at this now. I searched as if because I was just noticing this on my second read through. As
mm,
if appears on 725 of the roughly 1600 pages. She'll have this dialogue where, especially between Hank and Dagny, but also with a lot of other characters, um, where they'll kind of be psychic. Like the characters are kind of psychic, and they'll be like, they made this small gesture as if insert metaphysical assertion here, right? Uh,
yeah,
as if this philosophy were true, and it's like you know that's like on one hand like it's a novel, right? So like that's kind of literary, that's kind of like you make these affordances, right? But because of the fact that it's a novel, like there are certain things that you expect not to be fully realistic, but on the other hand it just stands out so much to me, and that's kind of why I have the take. I actually think like within the universe of the novel, the take that like Sadler's kind of been in the corruption arc this whole way, and that it's one entire corruption arc. I think that
yeah,
actually, like, I think like, I think John Galt literally says that, right? Um, but also, I think it kind of like fits in with the rest of the like, with the rest of the kind of like metaphysics of the story, right? Is that you have these corruption arcs, you have this like no half measures thing where reason will inevitably conclude carry you to one direction, and then like if you have no um there's almost a kind of like negative reason where it's like even though they're like not reasoning in Rand's mind, um the looters, the like basically the communists, they there's also an inevitability with them, right? For them, it's like it's inevitable that everything will collapse, but it's like the same deal where like Rand has like Calvinism in both directions, right? Both if you're evil and if you're good.
Hmm.
Um,
I
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I, would- I I'm glad that you looked up the whole asif phrasing. Uh, so this might be my I guess whenever I try to explain this idea to people about Rand, they don't like it very much because it sounds very right wing. Um, and the thing about Atlas Shrugged is that I think it's a book that only a woman could have written. And I've never seen a review like most feminist reviews of Ayn Rand are very hostile, but I really do think this is the type of sci-fi that only a woman could have written. And it is because of this attention to small gestures and things that are implied and so on. Uh, th there's a meme out there in, I think, fantasy and sci-fi where they say, how do men and female, how do male versus female authors write battle scenes, right? And the joke is that a man will describe like the exact battle formations, the moves that are executed, and then at the end, he sees his girlfriend, and then something happens off screen, and it takes like a page. And the the female version of the same battle, it's always like they feel so uncertain, they're reading the emotions. It's all about kind of like the emotional experience, and then the follow through, with their partner is also kind of this emotional, implied, very detailed, descriptive interaction. And somehow that meme really fits the story. And what I realize is that what she's describing is a very particular type of dystopia where it is actually these small subtleties of what is implied that end up mattering a lot. And I think this is why this book took me so long, I think, to understand. And I think why you have to read it and really soak in it. Having gone through, worked in a bureaucracy, having worked in academia, all these things, like it made sense to me now as an adult. I was like, that is right. That is in fact how people communicate. They communicate in kind of these half-veiled words and implications and things, and like they are subtle markers that you shouldn't miss. And that's how internal bureaucratic politics really works. And I was just it was just such an accurate measure of it. And I really, I think the greatest male like sci-fi authors, you can have Huxley, Orwell, Herbert, right? These are like their dystopias are like very different. You might call them kind of like the iron cage model, borrowing from like Philip Dick, where, you're either forcefully drugged or, forcefully, threatened to do things in one way or another. And Rand's is like a very different type, where it's just like you're kind of just lulled into it, and you might miss the signs if you're not paying attention. And it's funny, I think that it shows up in the language. I'm gonna borrow that, by the way, uh, Brian, at some
the
point
as if,
for
yeah, go
the
ahead, go ahead.
statistics. Yeah.
So,
Anyways.
there's a lot there. There's like two really interesting branching paths, right? There's the kind of sexual dynamics, and then there's the kind of nature of totalitarianism, right?
Mhm.
Because it's like, yeah, it's not 1984, but I actually want to get to that after. I kind of want to talk about the literary elements and the like, you know, um, yeah, I think like I think the part where like Ayn Rand comes through as like clearly an autistic woman is like have you do you remember the like every description of sex that she has, or there's like some conversation that like I think it's between Dagny and Francisco d'Anconia where they're talking about like the true meaning, the true meaning of sex and of desire. And she's like, oh, the true meaning of desire is to like love someone for their mind. Like I know a lot of like really libertarian, like really successful capitalist men. I don't know if they would call probably not objectivists, but like the type of person that like Rand would see as contributing a lot to the world, and it's not about the mind for them, you know. But I think this element is really interesting, and it's interesting because you say the feminists were critical, um, but I think like unironically, like if you're kind of to buy into the feminist frame, Rand did insert a view of feminine sexuality, of the kind of like feminine positivity that was like very controversial at the time, right?
Yeah, I agree, and what I enjoyed about it was that it wasn't like this throwaway like Sex and the City sexuality where it's like, oh, we're just like men, and that's, we're gonna have sex in the way that men do. Like her descriptions of it, this I did see in online comments, people saying they were very uncomfortable, I think, through the sex scenes of Atlas Shrugged. They are from the perspective of how, stereotypically a woman would describe it. I mean, she fetishizes, being dominated, all these other things. I mean, they come out, and for men to read that, right, it's very uncomfortable. But it is kind of the bread and butter of the romance literature. What are they called? The bodice rippers, I think, the books that you see at the supermarket. So I absolutely agree with you. It's definitely written from her perspective, and for male readers, it's sometimes like quite a bit shocking that that's, how she would think about it.
I will say that I didn't pick up on Rand's perspective on that as uniquely feminine, but I don't know how much my input as a gay dude is useful in that regard. Um,
Okay.
so
Here's a
I,
question that I really want your input on. Where's the gay mafia? Where's like the Peter Thiel Founders Fund, like gay mafia? There's like no gays in Atlas Shrugged, right? Where are
yeah,
they?
I mean,
They're true men of the
I,
mind.
I mean, in all seriousness, I think that it is mostly accurate to say that the Peter Thiel type gay mafia, it just didn't exist until recently, that it has been a product of recent cultural changes in some ways, and that it would be anachronistic to expect something like that to pop up in culture at that time. There are probably similar patterns that could be identified at that time, but to each era, its own cultural structure.
Yeah, I'm just googling now. Like, I'm just googling when Michel Foucault was alive. Okay, 1926 to 1984. When did he publish Order of Things, 1966, History of Sexuality, 1976. So this would have been like late Rand. So he came like a while after Rand. Um,
Yeah,
but yeah,
and
that's interesting.
most of those books were not, they didn't have the influence that they did until after the 60s. So one of the things that happens in academia, which is part of this article that I wrote, was there's a huge influx of new academics actually in the 60s, and then there's a drop off afterwards, and that's why you kind of cement that generation's views as kind of orthodoxy. But so you basically have to wait a few years until after Atlas Shrugged to see the effects of Foucault and others, um,
Well,
even though
Foucault
they've
didn't
been
really
around for a
start
while.
publishing until, or like his most well known works until like long after Atlas Shrugged. Atlas
Yeah,
Shrugged was
yeah, yeah, yeah.
1957. And yeah, Order of Things, 1966. Um, History of Sexuality, 1976. Um, yeah, it's yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I have much much else to say about the lack of the gay mafia. Although like it's interesting because I think in like the modern day, that's like sort of where I expect the Gulch to come from, right? If I like am following if I end up following some founder who's gotten like disappeared, um, and I like crash land on like a secret libertarian compound, I expect it to be run by like Peter Thiel and the gay
Yeah.
mafia.
And he's especially good looking in his 30s and unmarried. You're like, this guy's probably a little, yeah. Yeah. I,
Yeah,
I I think
Is
the
Gall
historical,
unmarried? I guess
yeah.
he is, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I
Although
No, go ahead.
the scenes with Dagny in his house would be a lot more interesting if he were married. But sorry, go on, go on.
No, I was just gonna say, I think as a matter of historical reality, I think these things are a little bit like would be below the surface. One of my one of my PhD uh, advisors, I think, had once said something like, if there had been uh, gay rights and Xanax, there would be no British Empire. And this was a way for him to summarize that a lot of the driving features or figures behind the expansion of British imperialism were, gay men, like closeted gay men, like people that, there's very good reason to suspect that they were gay, but they obviously just still played their role in the traditional way. So who knows? Maybe there's a gay mafia in Rand. You just can't see it.
Yeah, what one guy said, it's already there, right? you know, like what's the sex ratio of Galt's Gulch? I think of the named characters in Galt's Gulch. They're like two women and 30 something men. Do the math.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you want to have a libertarian utopia that is purely libertarians or purely objectivists or something like that, then I would, from a purely pragmatic point of view, recommend that people learn to be a bit gay, because otherwise they're a lot of the dudes are going to be very lonely in that place.
Yeah, it's interesting because she doesn't really um, talk about women as a class until the very end. There's like one throwaway line at the very end where one of the government people are like, the women, they'll always be on our side. It's like right after John Galt's speech. I took this screenshot. Let me find it. But they're like the
Yeah.
trade unionists, the women, and like the professors. They'll always be on our side. Those are the three constituency groups that get shouted out by
She
the
wasn't wrong.
by the government, by the like basically by the communists.
Yeah. She wasn't wrong. I mean, I've heard this argument before in other contexts around, say, the populations that you need to mobilize if you're going to carry out a communist revolution. You look for you define classes that are, easy to understand for people and that have some sort of grievance. And it the woman question, I think, comes up in like the question of Chinese communism. It would be, though I guess she wouldn't have known this given when she wrote Atlas Shrugged. It's not like we had a lot of stuff coming out of communist China, but
Yeah, well,
Well,
I
what's
think that,
interesting about this is that I think like communism has gotten, or let's say like state control has gotten a lot more tolerant of the kind of Stadler like figures. That's like I think the main innovation of like Dengism, right? Is the kind of state capitalism, the kind of like you maintain this powerful system of control with the buy-in and with like some certainly comparatively a much better life for like the men of the mind, like the super geniuses.
yeah, and on the and this returns to the Stadler point. One thing that I meant to mention about it is that even as I'm like defending, the idea that you shouldn't be a Stadler, I think that Deng, like you were saying, so I don't think Lee Kuan Yew was ever really a Stadler in the way that I would picture it. I do think it's unquestionable that Deng was, and I do think that Deng's success raises complications for Rand's vision in all sorts of ways, because he did just kind of sit around under this evil communist dictator guy and just wait until the dude died, and then he mildly changed society or massively changed things in ways that didn't like fundamentally uh, act like an ideological break from it and made things a lot better for a lot of people within that. And so I think that you really can look at Deng and say, well, okay, uh, clearly someone did compromise, and it's probably better that Deng was in that position than really any other Maoist in that position, and that does say something. Uh,
I
yeah,
I think that's right. I mean, what's interesting about the book is, I mean, I call what she's writing about basically longhouse dystopia. I mean, this is basically how it works. This is kind of how it feels. All these things. The interesting thing is you can describe how it works, but that doesn't quite tell you how to get out of it. And I think as you were just saying, sometimes the right approach is just to hide and wait. I think it takes a very special kind of person to dispel that kind of regime, I think. I can think of many brave academics or public figures that over the last 10, 15 years have, you know, really disliked, wokeism and the regime as it exists in the US. But, they've had zero impact and they, lost their positions and livelihood and so on. And you need someone like Trump and Vance and all these other folks to do what they needed to do. I think it's the same case in the Chinese case. It's a difficult one, right? It's a difficult question.
Yeah, in the end, at the very, very end, this is like the Omega spoiler. They actually ask John Galt to like come back and be dictator of America, right? Um, and uh, yeah, there are these kind of like reformist tendencies, or the idea that like the system has like lost the mandate of heaven, lost the ability to continue, that it needs to be infused with this new ideology. And you can kind of imagine Deng as like maybe the alternate ending where where John Galt or like Dr. Sadler or like someone who is like more, or like Dagny, someone who's like fairly competent, takes over as like dictator of America, right? Um, yeah, that's all I had to say on that front.
yeah. And now, like, to return to the point about like Rand's comments about women and uh, her relationship with other women and so forth, I do think that there is something that one of the things that I don't know that I wrestle with it about Atlas Shrugged, but I find it really, really interesting that by any objective measure, she is one of the most successful women to be a philosopher or philosopher adjacent in history. She is one of the most influential, one of the most successful, and in many ways, like uh, in her own way, like you're talking about with her whole like sexual liberation type of approach, in her own way, quite feminist with it, but she uh, wasn't really. I don't know that this is like putting myself in her shoes too much. It doesn't feel like she was all that fond um, of other women in a lot of ways, and I don't think that feminists have ever been particularly fond of her. And there's a really interesting tension there. Uh, the extent to which she could, if you squint, be seen as this like extraordinarily influential feminist icon in a way that just
Well, I
doesn't
think
actually
Rand's
map
vision of
onto the
feminism
reality.
won, right? Rand is like a proto Sheryl Sandberg, or like Dagny for sure, right? Dagny, like she is the lean-in girl boss, like literally, and she's like the most competent person in that entire company, right?
No, absolutely.
I mean, she's like a very specific. I mean, so the reason I say that she's not at all like Sheryl Sandberg is, I mean, I've met the feminists in academia, and right, and they as Sheryl Sandbergy as they might be, and they're of an older vintage. They still believe like representation matters, and it's clear that like Rand doesn't believe this. And the way she presents, I mean, Dagny's almost like a self-insert for her in some instances, but throughout the
Wait,
book, it's
wait,
emphasized.
almost like a self insert?
I mean,
Well,
I'm not.
it's
I'm
Dagny and John Galt, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but
But
yeah,
it's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
but like
A little bit inspired by her personal life. But sorry, go on, go on.
what's the thing that she emphasizes throughout the book is that everyone sees Dagny as a man, and it's only in very weird occasions when they realize that she's a woman. They remember that, oh, in fact, she's a stunningly beautiful woman, right? Like, I think that's Rand's version of feminism in some ways. It's like if you want to be in the and this is I think why it's a feminist book in some ways. I mean, what it's trying to say is the world of industry and enterprise has male coded values and virtues. And if you want to play in that world, you basically absorb those and take them as your own. And I think that's why she doesn't talk about other women. I think maybe oh God, I keep forgetting. The wife of the other magnate. I forget what her name is, but the one that's like
Reardon's
constantly
wife.
lying to. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Reardon's.
and she's like constantly lying and being manipulative and stuff. I mean, she stands as kind of this polar opposite version of her. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
I didn't realize how much they. I think like the first time I read it, I was like really attuned to like the like Stadler sadism.
Mm,
Wait, but I was like a lot. I was like a lot younger then. This was when I was like 16. So the first time I read it, I was like really not attuned to like the sexual dynamics and the kind of like and like the Mrs. Reardon sadism. Um,
yeah.
and yeah, I think she really hates Mrs. Reardon. Maybe more, and like Hank's family in general. I think like she hates Hank's family, and um, yeah, I think like uh, I think we are kind of maybe more adjacent to this world, right? But I think
Mm.
actually, I have no clue. I have no clue. But like I don't know. Let me know what you think of this. Like maybe for like the normal person, like the like Mrs. Reardon sadism is like even more clear than the Doctor Stadler the Doctor Sadler sadism. Like
I
the
mean, this
kind
is
of
how
like
I know that you're
suffering.
young, Brian, and you haven't had a toxic, dysfunctional romantic relationship yet. The Mrs. Reardon type of relationship is not that uncommon. I've
Yeah,
seen
yeah.
stuff like this play out in like, my partner's family, some of my own relationships. Like people get kind of weird when they're in dysfunctional relationships. And that one to me, I read it, it didn't seem to me unbelievable that she both wants to be her husband's like one and only, but she also kind of deeply resents him in some kind of accumulated way that's, you know, permanently spoiled, and but she doesn't know how to exit the relationship, and so she's just destructive. Like I've seen that play out. That's probably a pattern of dysfunction, I think, in a lot of places, quite honestly.
Yeah, like I see it now, right?
Yeah.
At the time I didn't see it. Although it's interesting because like you can going back to like how she always got in fights with like Hayek and like with conservatives too, right? With Buckley, with Reagan, and
Mm.
so on. Um, or like Reagan wasn't in the fight, but she was like, I don't think of Reagan. Um, but yeah, there's this aspect where she, yeah, where like you know they're almost like a kind of like tool to like torture Hank Reardon with, right? Like
Mm.
Hank Reardon is supposed to be like the Bill Buckley type character or some version of him, like a successful capitalist, but also like a conservative, right? A conservative who like believes in like faith flag in the family and is like a boomer conservative and cares about like traditional sexual morality and like the kind of Reagan or sorry the Reagan Freudian slip, but the Reardon family is sort of like set up as a torture machine for like those kinds of people.
I don't think it's like a like an indictment of traditional family values or things of that sort. I think what she like the reason I found it very insightful and useful, as I said, having been in relationships that feel very close to that, and as a Hispanic, the classic, parents that hate each other dynamic. I've seen that a lot as well. Um, I think what she's trying to say is to kind of just not be dumb and like realize that there's like the form and the substance of things, and like these things might have the form of a family, but the substance of it, as you said, is a bit of a torture machine. Um, so I found her descriptions like somewhat almost like inspiring and soothing in the sense that in the end like what she's trying to say is that Frank's like being in that situation is still his own choice. Like he has a choice to exit dysfunction. He just never exercises it until later in the novel. And I think that's what she's trying to say. I don't think she's indicting the setup. Or maybe she is. Maybe she's basically saying the setup at this point is such a bad heuristic for telling you things that work versus things that don't work. But I think the modern day society basically tells you without those heuristics, you're even more lost at sea. So maybe that's the best that we get, I think, in terms of creating kind of a fabric for families and society. But yeah,
Trace, any takes? Any Mrs. Reardon
No,
takes?
sorry, I disconnected briefly, so I missed the start of that. So no, I
All good, all good. Um, it's interesting because yeah, she to go back to like Rand's Calvinism. I think it's like it's almost hard to distinguish between the idea that like Reardon has a choice to leave and doesn't, and like this is a natural consequence of like his philosophy, right? Um, that's something that I think this is actually something that's also really true of the Fountainhead and of Rand's writing, that like the characters are prophetic, but like the characters kind of like see into the future and talk about things that like happen in the future in like weirdly specific terms, but also um unbelievably specific terms even for a novel. But um yeah, it's like an open question because on one hand she does talk about this in terms of like guilt and Christian morality of like you know when Mrs. Reardon like blackmails him and the state blackmails him based on like his affair with Dagny, based on Reardon's affair with Dagny. He kind of that's what makes him gives in, and the argument, which is kind of explicit by the end, um is that like it's in the like John Galt speech of like that like the sexual morality is what kind of capitulates to the kind of communist morality, right? That like you give them these things to blackmail you for, that it's like this kind of anarcho tyranny where they can accuse every man of this crime, even when like Jim Taggart is the same and like all these communists, they're behaving in the same way. But like that like guilt gives the state the ammunition to blackmail you, right? Like that's literally what happens in the book. And then there's this other interpretation, which is like you know um you can have the family values, but they have to be like the right family, right? I think there are like married couples in Galt's Gulch, in the objectivist utopia, but they are kind of like kind of like constantly re-choosing, constantly like evaluating their partner's value. I think that's the idea, right? And that's kind of what happens with Dagny in the book too, right?
yeah. I, I think that's a good reading. I mean, I'll have to think about this later today. Um, but I mean, something maybe this is more a reflection of her and her time and her milieu with other libertarians in that era. But there's a there's a particular way of thinking about morality and Christianity and so on, right? Where I call it the like school marm model of God, right? Where you're like supposed to follow these rules, and if you break them, you should feel bad because you broke the rule, right? And I think at different, and so you get the Ten Commandments, and they're just rules that you're supposed to not break, right? You're not supposed to engage in adultery, or you should feel bad about it. Um, And then there's the other way of thinking about God, which is like God as your therapist, and the commandments are basically, you know, guidelines for like living a better life. And
Yeah, the Jordan
ultimately, you
Peterson
know,
ideology.
yeah, or the JD Vance ideology, right? Where it's like, well, sin is just you destroying yourself. And like you could lie and say, well, I technically did follow the rule, but it's like you kind of know that you didn't follow the spirit of it. And I think that's kind of what comes out. I think perhaps the lesson here is that it's from the outside, it's quite hard to judge whether, you know, him leaving his wife or not was right or not, right? Like only he can sort of judge that. But I think this leaves society in a very weird place where the norms are hard to read. They become a little bit illegible from the outside, right? You could say, well, is this man engaging in good adultery or bad adultery? Is he leaving a good marriage, or is he ruining a good marriage, or is he exiting a bad one, right? And thus, should we grant him the divorce or not? And it used to be that you would have to go through these like much more complicated community and, you know, legal procedures to exit a marriage, right? Depending on the society. But I think it her conclusion might be drawn from this view of morality or religion as kind of the, you know, the the judge or the school marm version of it, where you have to follow the rules. But I think a more like realistic appraisal of how this has historically worked would probably have led her to be like, you know, it's not that the guilt is bad. It's like, you know, if you're exiting a bad marriage, you shouldn't feel guilty about it, and you could make the public case. You know, people have done this throughout history where they're like, I was in a unhappy marriage, thus I should be allowed to divorce my wife. You know, so I don't know. It's an interesting one.
Yeah, this is one area where I'm a lot more traditionalist than Rand ultimately, and her ideal, like constantly re-choosing and re-choosing and re-choosing frame of, you know, this is the pure libertarian marriage. Stuff like that is where none of that really resonates with me at all. I think that she underestimates the value and the genuine use of locking yourself long term into something, committing yourself long term into something, and saying, I am going to figure out how to make this work. And, you know, this that the guarantee is part of the value of this, the absolute commitment to this, and the reassurance for the parties in it that they are committed to it is part of it. You know, I think that she could appreciate the value of contracts a bit more as someone so market oriented. But
Yeah, which she does, right? Like there's this part where like Reardon talks about the importance of kind of fulfilling all of his contracts, um, and these are like contracts for like steel, right, or like Reardon metal, this like new metal he invents. Um, yeah, where it's like, you know, when does that end and a marriage contract begins? I mean, like one way to read it, um one way to read it is that, you know, that the ethics of marriage themselves are the problem, and one way to read it is that like, um you know, Hank should have picked better. Like, Hank never should have gotten married to her, and once you get married you are kind of in a trap, but like, um that's just all the more reason for you like to marry better, right? But I think you can kind of tell by revealed preference. You can tell by what, Rand actually does, what specific vision, you know, she has of this.
But I think what Tracing's kind of alluding to, not to misinterpret your point, but I think there's like a theory of the firm, but like for human relationships. Like, you know, the one of the theories of the firm is that, you know, you could in fact negotiate a contract with a worker like every day, right? And that would maximize utility in like in a specific way. But the like, why do people commit to working at a company for a long period, and why does a company in fact pay a worker for a long period, even if they're not fully using their labor, right, for that period? And the reasons is that, you know, there's you're mitigating against, future cost fluctuations, the randomness of the market, all these other things. You want to make sure that you have labor available, even, and you don't have to go to the open market to get it right in the moment that you need it. There's all these things. And so, there's like, in a free market, you still get firms, right? You don't get like every man is an individual. You do get firms that come out of it. You could say the same for human relationships. I mean, her view is more like she's the perpetual contractor. She's an eternal like 1099 in the romance department, and she's
Yes.
just going from guy to guy to guy, right? And it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. For some people, the W-2 makes way more sense, the romantic W-2. And in fact, for the vast majority of people, that's actually what you need. So I think that's basically, it comes down to that in some ways.
Yeah, and I do think it is interesting in that specific relationship, like the Reardon relationship, that it seemed like she was sort of starting from ground zero to create this like optimal scenario in which it is okay to be a really crummy husband because the person you married really, really, really deeply fundamentally deserves to have you as a really crummy husband, and their whole role has been to like drag you to the depths and everything. And I think like it's that I think is her choice that resonated with me the least, or seemed like the least supportable in a sense of like how the world generally works. Or yeah, I do think that it was a little bit like I mean obviously the whole book is didactic. In that case, I think it was um, I don't know yeah how productive that particular form of
Well, I mean, I think what comes out in that specific relationship is because, the whole idea of like guilt is what makes you vulnerable, and leads you to think that suffering in and of itself is good. I think for a lot of people that resonates in the kind of economic social sense, but when you get into the personal, it feels a little bit mushy. And I think what she was trying to highlight there is this is the consequence. Like, if you think that like suffering in the personal sense is like a prerequisite for these personal relationships to work, this is why it's bad. I think that's what she was trying to get at in that one. And I don't know. I had
yeah no
grandparents who have both passed at this point, and it was clear they hated each other. And I don't understand why they stayed married for like 60 years. It like never made any sense to me. But
So I was trying to look up the sex scene, um, but but there's an interesting element to Atlas Shrugged where the affair I think is more hot than like just having sex with someone. That there's a kind of desire to be desired. You get this the most with Jim Taggart, with like the shop girl who he marries. Um, but there's also a desire for like your partner to be desired by other people. Um,
hmm,
you actually get this with you get this in two ways. You get this with Miss Reardon when she gets Hank Reardon to like go to the party with go to the wedding party with Jim. Um, that she sees her husband being desired by like all these like politicians and businessmen and whatever, and she like really gets off to that. And then there's another aspect of this, which is the kind of like intersexual competition, um, where this is what I was trying to look up. I'm pretty sure like the horniest Hank ever gets is like after he learns that like um, Dagny like slept with Francisco as a kid, and or as like a 17-year-old whatever, um, and and he like Francisco they have this blowout, and then um that's when Hank is horniest. Is when he knows that like the woman he loves is like desired so deeply by his rival. This is like very mimetic, right?
and
And
I mean, to me,
I,
it's. Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm kind of curious what like Rand would think of dating apps for this reason, right? Because it is this like literal elo system. where like it's the people who are like desired the most, like kind of almost competing with each other. But sorry, go on.
I was gonna say that scene. So the scene that you're talking about is Francisco and Dagny are talking, and then Frank comes in, and they get into a physical fight, and Frank wins because he's like, whatever.
No. So,
But
so Francisco
is that
chooses
what it is?
not to fight back.
Right,
There,
right, right,
she
right,
she
right.
really emphasizes like so it's not like really a fight. Like he hits Francisco once, and then there's like a long description of Francisco like holding in his anger, and it's like real. It's like really intense, and she like really emphasizes that it takes him like a lot of effort to like try and not fight back, and he doesn't. He doesn't fight back.
Right. I mean, it's implied that by that action, he's revealing, in your Calvinist way, that he doesn't deserve her or whatever at that point, or he's not the right one for her. But to me, this read almost like a National Geographic like video where you see two birds fighting and then one of them leaves. Like I can, it's like you can tell that she believes in hypergamy in some ways, right?
Yes,
Like the
Well,
man that
very
fights for
very
her and
clearly.
wins deserves her.
yeah, but I think it's also part of the key for me is not when you're talking about things like dating apps. Part of the key, I think, in it and the way she's writing it is not to be desired, but to be desired in the right way by the right person for the
Mm,
right reasons. That is, and this goes back to like this meeting of the minds, things like that. That she really emphasizes, the sure the sexual and the romantic element, but even more, and this is the whole Galt's Gulch concept, just like finding a kindred spirit, finding someone who is doing things right, who understands things right, who is approaching the world correctly. And that I think part of the point of her being desired thing is uh, this sense not of like in this general competition with the public thing, but competition among the people who matter to her. This sense of, are these people worth getting attention from? Is this the sort of person I would want romantic attention from? And then if I get romantic attention from them, that is a compliment. Uh,
yeah.
yeah, I think that that's distinct from just this pure
I,
like
I,
mark dating, whatever.
Yeah, I think I agree with Tracy on this. I would think that she would have a negative view of dating apps. Because what's interesting about dating apps is you don't it's not like they're giving you the desirability score for potential partners. I haven't used dating apps in like 8 months to a year, so I don't know if things have changed, but you don't actually quite know their desirability and the interactions of that person with others. And one of the things that I think would matter in the mimetic sense is that you know whether someone's like attractive or not. I think maybe the thing that would be closer to the mimetic aspect of showing off a partner is like, you know, people trying to interact with men or women on Instagram, right? And seeing how many followers they have and all this other stuff. That I think would be closer. And in some places, Instagram is in fact sort of a dating app.
Many such
But
cases. But yeah,
yeah.
I absolutely agree. It's like, yeah, to go back to the mimetic aspect, like part of the reason why Hank is so horny, I think, is because he actually respects Francisco, right? He respects Francisco as like an intellect, as like a competent like businessman. By that point, that's like well established, right? It's past the point where he started to respect Francisco, and like that's why he's so horny, I think, or at least part of why he's so horny is that he like actually respects the competition, right? Maybe in your reading, in your reading he wins, but like he still thinks he poses a real threat, and he poses a real threat in like the same kind of um in the same kind of way, in the same kind of way. Like he's valuable to Dagny in the same way that Hank is valuable to Dagny, right? Um, where they're both like they're both like men of the mind. They're both like someone who she falls in love with because of their like basically their philosophy and their like ability. um yeah, I think that mimetic aspect is like very important. It's very important that they're kind of like competing on the same axis, and they're competing like not just for the same person but over the same values. Well,
I think I agree.
um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
um, yeah. You guys want to talk about the nature of authoritarianism?
Uh, yeah, I mean, I think we could. Again, I wasn't sure how much you guys had gotten into this specific topic. What I really love about this book as an adult is that it shows you that this kind of stuff doesn't work in exactly the way that we presume that it works. Like, it's not marked by military parades and the secret police and all this other stuff. It's this kind of diffused miasma everywhere, I think. And it's kind of hard to pick up because any specific aspect of it, you could say, is like a normal feature of human society, but there's like a particular constellation of symptoms that gives you what for her is kind of this dystopia. So, but I don't know what else, what more there is to say along those lines. I feel like this kind of way of thinking and this kind of diagnosis is quite recent, I think, for us. And the the reason I think she's prophetic is, I mean, she's describing a type of, you might call it authoritarianism or dystopian or decline. I mean, there's all these other words for it that I think wasn't that evident back then, and in fact takes quite a while to kind of unfold in the United States. I mean, we don't really start explicitly talking about this type of decline in the US until the last 10 years or so here. So
I
it's,
I would sort of disagree with that. I mean, both in terms of like her upbringing in the Soviet Union,
mm,
seeing all that stuff, or in Russia, and then seeing the Russian Revolution, and then in the Soviet Union, seeing all that sort of thing happen directly. And then in the United States, I think we've really been having the same back and forth arguments in the country in a lot of ways for since before her time, and a lot of the like specific laws she was pointing to, a lot of the like specific here, this fairness thing, whatever, were things that were at least actively debated or actively implemented somewhere at the time she wrote the book. I think that there have been, you can definitely make the case that there have been some ways it accelerated or some ways it intensified, but I think that she was, my impression at least is that her writing was less prophetic and more descriptive in that regard. That she was very much prepared to have written that sort of thing coming out of the Soviet Union and wanting to do everything she could to convey to people, the opposite of that. Like whatever these guys are doing, do not do that thing.
yeah. Well, so let me clarify what I mean by this. So, and perhaps now that I think about the fact that they do have this kind of supreme leader in the background, I think that kind of discredits a bit of what I meant.
Wait, who's the
Originally, I
supreme leader?
my the, what is it, president, whatever his, you know, he's so irrelevant. But I think this is why I think that, let me clarify, I guess, my point for tracing. I mean, what you're describing about the dynamics of authoritarianism or totalitarianism in the Soviet Union and in other places is correct. What I was describing is kind of this ethos that maybe we can do a word search for this later, of when, when all these people say like, oh, it wasn't my fault, there's nothing that could have been done, um and then at the end it's that's the thing that kind of permeates society and all that. I mean, what she's describing is a little bit different than the authoritarianism that exists at that point or that she would have experienced. So, for the Russian Revolution, you have an armed conflict, you have a change of regime, and you have a new set of institutions and norms that are enforced by force. And this, you get the same in every other communist country. What she's describing here is kind of this, you know, degradation of habits and spirit, and then people kind of fall into this soft authoritarianism without necessarily having a coup or a violent revolution. And I think that's why it's prophetic. I mean, because that historically is not what you see, especially anything that they would have that would have been, I think, relevant in that time period when she was writing. I
True,
don't know what
but
your thoughts
so
are on that.
It's interesting because the regime that comes to mind as um the regime that comes to mind is like pre pre Hitler Weimar, in terms of things just getting worse and like degrading and things turning to shit. And then I guess like, well, in the end you obviously get more violence, but like Hitler won the election, right? Um like he wins the election first, and then there's violence, and then there's like the secret police and so on.
Right, but what she's describing is like a specific type of like virulent incompetence that takes over society. And you wouldn't really accuse the Nazi regime of bringing that about. I mean, what she's
Well, no,
describing to me
this
reminds
was
me of,
exactly what happened like pre Nazi, right? This is the Nazi regime doesn't cause it, but they're kind of the response to it, where like there's rampant inflation, there's like kind of all of these like self destructive industrial programs, um, yeah, and like life just fucking sucks. Um,
but
and like part
I
of that
would
is because
say
of the war reparations and like Versailles and so on.
yeah, they,
But like
yeah.
you know, um, it is a kind of like devolution into authoritarianism from like the perspective of like things fucking suck and now we need a revolution.
yeah, I think even without going overseas, though, even sticking with the United States, this is where I still wind up disagreeing a bit. I think if you look at the specifics of like what was happening under Hoover, what was happening under FDR, what was happening in some of these early 20th century, um, administrations, these were the live debates that were going on then. These were the live conversations that were going on then, and Durand was being extremely responsive to trends that she saw and people were arguing about in society at the time. I think it is true that these things have repeated, that parts of them have intensified, that scope of government has changed, scope of society has changed in some ways. I don't think we ever experienced like a fundamental shift from what had been happening in her day in the United States.
So I guess the reason I still find, so let me give out one of the other reasons I sort of disagree with I guess Tracy's take on this. When I was reading kind of her description of what the workers had become like at Taggart International, and how they're always saying like it's not my fault, nothing could have been done, kind of this shifting about of responsibility, and how that spreads out through most of society in a kind of sanctioned way. Um, there's a book that's called, what is it, 1435, 15, I think it might be 1542, A Year of No Significance, or it's like it's the 10th year of the Wanli Emperor in the Ming Dynasty. And it's a portrait of bureaucrats within the Ming, uh, as kind of in this random year that was picked by the author. And this is kind of one of the issues that you get in this large bureaucratic system is exactly these words of like, oh, nothing could have been done, or it's not my fault. And I can sort of see that logic taking hold in a bureaucracy because it has no particular constraints to enforce other types of behavior. But at least to me, the idea that this would radically spread through the rest of society and infect it in this way, I don't think I've read any other, either present or past kind of, theoretician or writer describing this kind of process, and definitely not in the American context. I feel like aspects of it are definitely present, I think, throughout, I think in every society and definitely in American society. But like to me, just reading this book and just taking my time with it, it describes a particular type of sickness that I think just historically doesn't quite exist on the scope that she describes it. And maybe she meant it as an exaggeration, as a warning, but um, I
I think
think
I
that,
half agree with this take. The
yeah.
extent to which I agree with it is that I think that there is this kind of like traitor to capitalism, embodied by like Jim Taggart, right?
Mm,
Who is this kind of like he kind of advocates for the railway conglomerate. He like works with the state to like increase the stock prices, and so on. And so he's this like crony capitalist, right? And I think
Yeah.
people were not really understanding like the capitalism versus communism framework. um like they were not understanding like the traders to capitalism. They were not understanding the kind of political economy dynamics. They were not understanding to your suggestion of new books. I think the best like economic understanding of this comes from Gordon Tullock, um and forget if his co-author was Pat Buchanan, but the calculus of consent, where he kind of talks about this, and he kind of talks about like the interaction with state and with policies, and like who benefits from price controls and so on and so forth. Very strong um, like economic theory, and some applied as well, some kind of empirical as well. Um, what's what's really wrong about the picture. I also kind of agree that there's this kind of aspect of decline and like disappointment and everything sucking that does have like a precedence in the Soviet Union and with like post communist states. And like Václav Havel talks about this in like in like former Yugoslavia, like Soviet occupied Yugoslavia. I guess that comes after, but like they're examples of this happening. They're like describing a real thing that's happening in like these like communist states, right? Um, so the kind of like morale problems, I think that's like actually pretty um, well existing, but the kind of aspect of it coming through from like basically like capitalist bureaucracies and like these states that can no longer compete and are like trying not to get disrupted. I think that was like kind of new, although that's like in the mainstream. That's like mainstream economics now.
Yeah.
It's like really expanded a lot on how people think about that issue has really expanded a lot. One other
So
aspect that
I
I
mean,
want to point to is like the moral code of authoritarianism, where like it's a very important plot point that like the capitalists have to consent, right? That like they really insist on like Reardon has this trial where they like try to find him, and he's like, I don't respect the court, and the court basically lets him get away with it. And I think that that's just like totally unrealistic, right? Like, it could be a Soviet court, could be like, like FDR's court. Like, they'd like still find him anyway. They'd like arrest him, and they'd like take his medal and like hold him in contempt of the court. Like, I think that scene is just like completely unrealistic, and just how much like the rationality, the consent, the kind of like the kind of metaphysics matter. I think in terms of like realpolitik terms, it's just like completely unrealistic.
so if
Yeah.
I can,
So, I will need to get going in a couple minutes, by the way. But I think
Oh, good.
that in terms of the consent element, um, I I agree that there are a lot of scenarios in which it's unrealistic. I think that, and I think Rand obviously romanticizes this vision of like people just being so right that everyone recognizes and has to recognize how right they are and has no rebuttal and has no answer because they're just blinded by the clear
and then
ultimate
everyone
rightness of this
claps.
different position. Yeah, yeah, and that's absolutely a tendency of hers. But I do think the grain of truth in that and the grain of accuracy in that is the sense that there are a lot of systems that do take their strength from being seen as moral and take their strength from being seen as good and seen as people collaborating and agreeing and everyone accepts that this is the right way to do things. And I do think that as soon as someone like questions the premises of that and rejects the premises of that and makes the tensions that have been implicit explicit and makes the moral disagreements within it explicit, I do think that leads to a lot of like um, shattering an illusion of consensus. And I'm not a fan of the Trump admin at all, but I think that the Trump admin sort of demonstrates this in a lot of ways in terms of a lot of things that had been sort of polite fictions as long as everyone agreed to. Um, this new admin comes in and is like, yeah, we don't actually like these polite fictions and we're not going to do them. And suddenly a lot that had apparent authority started shattering because people just wanted to shift the moral frame around.
If I could, I think you guys have changed my mind on a couple things. If I may if I might make two quick points. So um, I think on the point about consent. I I I I think you guys are right that that is in fact what she's trying to show. And one of the books that I think might be worth checking out is called Revolution on My Mind. I forget who the author is, but it's an analysis of the diaries of a bunch of officials and business people and functionaries in Soviet society. And what it shows you is that people really, really do consent to these systems. Like they're all true believers almost in communism, even if it's not like quite working out for them. And what you can see is like they come up with excuses for the disappointments of their lives that are related to the system, and they blame themselves for it. So I think this element of consent is very important. The the piece where I would push back a little bit is I think on the general incompetence of the system. The underproduction and the slowdown in improvements in material well-being for socialist economies doesn't really hit until like the 60s, sorry, the 70s. And this happens for both truly communist societies as well as for other kind of state-managed societies, and it also in the United States. I think, one famous case is Mexico, where you have the 30-year miracle for industrialization and development, and then it slows down. But they have all these pair state industries and groups that they support, as well as kind of welfare that they then subsidize with petroleum wealth because petroleum prices spike in the 70s. And turns out the Soviet Union does the same. So I would think the incompetence, the pathologized kind of incompetence piece would have been very hard for Rand to make, because I think at that point the predominant view was that communist systems could in fact grow wealthier over time. So I wouldn't have seen that as something there. But you guys did change my mind on this, so I'll leave with that.
Yeah, the economics are really interesting because it's this thing that happens. There's a often like kind of historical critique of Marx, which is like just empirically correct, of like the communist revolutions happened in very poor countries, right? It wasn't this like historical progression where the most capitalist countries became communist. It was these like basically tribal societies or monarchies in the case of Russia, tribal
Hmm.
societies in some other countries, that actually made the leap to communism and had industrialization kind of step side by side with communism. And I think the fact that it happens that Alice Shrugged takes place in the U.S. actually really matters. And she even raises this as a plot point, right? Like Francisco d'Anconia says, like who runs like the copper empire says like, oh, if he didn't intentionally destroy his copper empire, then the communists could have kept running it. And he contrasts this with like the railroad, right? He says like the railroad's a complex system. You can't run the railroad on slave labor. You have to have people who are like actually thinking about things. But the copper mines, you can just run the copper mines forever, and so he has to destroy the copper mines to make sure that like the communist states of America like actually collapses. And I think that's like I think that's indicative of like the actual historical trend, where like you're exactly right. Like these resource economies do, especially if they start off at a lower like productivity level, do continue to grow as long as they can like keep doing the obvious thing, right? Because you started off from these like tribal societies that were like not using oil and like you know not using machinery, like not having factories, and like you know I basically think like Hayek's critiques are true, but you do get this scale up where like the economies of scale just in the kind of developing economies, kind of unindustrialized economies, do end up being positive up until a certain threshold. I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, yeah. Huh.
Well, looks
All
like you
right.
you
Well,
guys are tired. Yeah, got to head out.
yeah, I
Shall
gotta
we
head
wrap
out.
up?
This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, this was really fun. I'll stick around for a little bit if there are people in the audience who want to ask some questions. But feel free to head out if you need to be.
Nice meeting you, Tracing.
Well, there doesn't seem to be anyone. So this was really fun. Yeah. Uh, let's call it there. Thanks so much.
Yeah,
Oh, Trace is gone, and then thanks so much, Manny. This was really fun.
same here. I think the next one should definitely be about Madoka.
About
We should definitely
which one?
Madoka Magica. I think that should be the
Oh,
next
yes,
topic of
yes.
discussion.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the Randian reading of Madoka is really interesting
Well,
because
that's exactly what I kept thinking when you were talking about the Calvinism, because I mean, on the
yes,
different
yes.
timelines, they make the same wish because of the people who they are. They basically say you can only make a different wish if you're somebody different, right? It's just predetermined in some way. It
It's
that
interesting because after I wrote my article, I realized that a lot of these things were like completely like novel and mind blowing to some of my friends who are like very familiar with Madoka lore. Maybe more important, maybe more familiar with like what actually happens in the story than I am. But like these were like ideas that were not obvious to people in um, the like Madoka Magica theorizing community.
yeah.
Um, so that was really interesting. But you're
Right. I
absolutely
think we
right
should
that like
go.
there's a really strong aspect of like self denial here, but like
Mm,
Madoka Magica, um, the consequences of self denial are like a lot more real to me of what happens in Madoka Magica than in Atlas Shrugged. I think that it's in many ways like it's just like you know fantasy thing, but it's a lot more realistic in like what actually happens to people who kind of like deny their own desires.
yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. Well, I would say put it on the books, schedule it, and I'll definitely join for that one. That is
Yeah,
one
I
that's
mean,
very close to the heart.
I wanted to do that now. Damn, I want to do it now. Yeah, you
We got it for
guys
2 hours though.
should. Yeah, yeah. I totally get if you need to go. Um,
I don't know. Maybe
yeah,
let's do
let's
it
call
this
it there. Let's
weekend.
call it
Do it.
there.
Let's do it this
We'll
weekend.
do another
Why don't we
one.
do it? Yeah, let's do it this weekend. I like it. I like it.
Or do
Well,
you
thanks
mean
for
like next
having me, Brian.
weekend, or do you mean like actually this weekend?
We could do it this weekend. I'm just working this weekend, so
Okay. I might not be. Next weekend might be
okay.
better for me, but let's see. Let me see what's up, and then yeah.
Yeah, round up some people,
Awesome,
round up
great.
some
Thank you
reads.
so much for being here. Yeah,
No worries.
round up some men of the mind and talk about yeah. See ya.
All right, take care. Bye.